Hello and welcome to the University of Utah Press's podcast. I'm Hannah New, and with me today are two magnificent poets, Philip Schaefer and David Baker. David Baker chose Philip Schaefer's manuscript for the Aga Shahid Ali Poetry Prize, and Schaefer's book Bad Summon came out in the spring of this year. Philip Schaefer is the author of 3 chapbooks and the book Bad Summon. He won the Meridian Editor's Prize in Poetry in 2006 and received his MFA from the University of Montana in Missoula. David Baker is the author of numerous books of poetry, including Scavenger Loop and Never Ending Birds. Baker has also written 6 books of criticism and is currently a professor of English and serves as poetry editor of the Kenyon Review. Welcome.
Thank you, Hannah.
David, can you explain why you chose Philip's manuscript from all the books that you received?
No. Sure. First of all, thank you for having us do this talk. I love Phil's book, and we met for the first time 5 minutes ago, so it's nice to sit in a little room and talk about this book that I read very hard whenever that was, a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I was thinking.
Me neither.
Yeah, what? No, you know how these things are. The press sent me a couple of dozen manuscripts, I think, a bunch of manuscripts, and I started reading, just not thinking I was looking for a book that was going to win anything, but just to find some voices that seemed authentic, first of all. And I was able to divide them out pretty quickly. About half of them I was not interested in at all. And about half of them, quite a few of them, in other words, I liked. I thought there were some cool things in those books. And then the hard work begins. I remember having about 8 or so manuscripts at one point. I remember one of the ones I really liked getting taken away. I think somebody else won a prize. That happens. There's a lot of shuffling. And then I remember sitting with Phil's book and 2 or 3 others and that terrible responsibility of selecting one of them. Nonetheless, Phil's book was the one that still asserted itself for the other ones, and it was some quality of the treatment of material that seemed to me interesting and new and strange and artful and vulnerable. Something in the tone, something in the treatment of the narratives. The voice seemed very strong to me, smart, wounded, culpable. Maybe we can come back to that. The business of being culpable or responsible for the doing of harm or the making of language about harm and hurt and responsibility really convinced me. I thought this is a really grown-up book where I read a lot of books and people tend to position themselves these days as fairly heroic, or the casting of blame, not this book. Plus, it was just written better than all the rest of them. Just line by line, phrase by phrase.
Oh, that's great.
That's a way long answer, but that's kind of what I was thinking.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Philip, this is your first book, and since I'm in publishing, I always like to hear about first book authors' responses to the publishing process.
Yes. So it was my first full length. Luckily, I had 3 chapbooks published before, so I was familiar with some of the ins and outs logistically, but not the full length circulation. And when I found out, David immediately emailed me and said, "Hey, enjoy the ride," I think is what you said.
I think I remember that, yeah.
And I did.
It's not over.
It's not. Thankfully, this feels like, the climax of it. But I wasn't aware of all the logistics and the details and the contracts and the fine print. And you talked me through a lot of that, Hannah, via email, which helped. But I still was like, what on earth does this mean? How does that translate? Mm-hmm. And as this being my first full-length book, I'm a rookie to it all. And last year there was a writers' retreat in Montana called the Beargrass Writers Festival, and an editor from Milkweed Editions was there, and I got to talk to him. It was just after I found out about this being published, and he said to not let yourself get strong-armed, but to make sure you get the things you want. And I was like, oh, Because in my head, I'm like, yes, yes, yes to everything. Mm-hmm. I just got my first book accepted. It's a lifelong dream. So whatever you guys want to do, I'm okay with. And he was like, I understand that sentiment. You're excited, but slow down and make sure things are done, thoroughly. Right. And I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And once I did that, I probably asked you a lot of annoying questions that were simple to answer. But that for me was, you provided a lot of clarity, like slowly with me, and it helped a lot.
You definitely stood up for yourself in the process. You definitely didn't roll over on something.
I did want a particular photo on the back cover, and in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't do it.
Okay, I'm glad I convinced you of that. So, David, in your review, you state that Philip's poetry is relatively more interior, more intimate and isolate, and yet it is also fully connective. So how is Philip able to accomplish this in his poetry? What role do these dualistic tensions have on thinking through issues of majesty of nature and the quiet violence humans inflict upon themselves and others? It's a long question.
Yeah. Can I jump in real quickly?
Yeah, please. Answer that one for me.
Well, no, I can't. I do think that before the book was called Bad Summon, it was titled Hideous Miraculous. Uh-huh. And then when David said that, he was speaking to the section called Hideous Miraculous, because that's more interior. And the first and third sections have a little more of the outer world influence. So I'm just thinking that the quietness question is related specifically to section 2.
It partly is, but it also to the whole book and that negotiation in the book between what I find, one of the things I found really interesting in the poems, especially in the first and last sections, is how difficult it is to speak in the plural, in the first person plural, and to use that sort of odic, old capability to presume to speak in behalf of others. That's a very complicated political circumstance, and it's one of the things. I mean, these poems are heartful. They happen deep in the soul or the mind of the speaker. That's what I meant by interior. They're feely. There's a lot of, the giving up of hurt. And yet they also presume and capably speak in the plural for groups. Sometimes that's just a group of two, the speaker and the speaker's sweetie, or sometimes it's neighborhoods or friends. Sometimes it's a whole nation, kind of the way Whitman presumed to make that speech. That's one of the odd, really powerful echoes that I hear throughout this whole book, in fact, is this kind of very belated Whitman voice. One of the poems that I was thinking about asking you to read later, or one of the ones that seems to represent that, is a poem called Going Down, where there's that plural voice, in fact, kind of dissolves bodily in the poem, the way Whitman dissolves at the end of Song of Myself. So it's something about the negotiation between communities of behavior and discourse and this solitary speaking I. That was the interesting thing to me.
Great. Thank you. So, Philip, in the closing line of your poem, Bad Summon, which is also the title of the book, how we all become the shape of our bodies leave behind. So can you talk more about the role of death in this collection of poetry, as well as your process behind naming the book Bad Summon?
Yes, I'll move backwards. Like I said before, I initially titled the book Hideous Miraculous, and that's how it was received before it was published. Because it was published as a chapbook, there were reasons it couldn't be also the full length. So I spent a month just going through the poems and bouncing ideas off friends and David, and thought that this poem represented both in tone and content what the book was trying to achieve. That last line and the role of death in the book is multitude. I think many poets have weird obsessions with the things they don't know, death being a primary one. I used to live in Chicago for 4 years, and then I moved to Missoula, where I've been for 5 years. And I was trying in this book to negotiate those experiences of seeing, a death count in South Chicago every day on the news and just seeing numbers, right? And you grieve, but you don't even know because it's so much. And then in Missoula and the greater surrounding area, where you do have this large backdrop. You have rivers forking through town. You have mountains that you can just reach out and touch, essentially, similar to Salt Lake. And the crimes and violences that happen in and around there over the last few years are a lot brighter because of it. And so I focused on those. For example, several years back, a couple was on their honeymoon and they were hiking Glacier National Park. They got in a fight and she pushed him off a cliff to his death. Wow. To me, that is just the most mind-blowing, murder or death situation. And there are countless others that have happened since I've lived there. And I can't help myself but being drawn to them in some way, whether it's just being an observer who's putting pen down to paper or trying to investigate it psychologically for my own weird sanity.
Do you mind reading a couple of poems?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'll read Growing Down.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, for sure. Growing Down. We buy animals to replace other animals. We fold paper and give wings to a swan. This isn't the way we imagined our dying, rolling around in the clay to better understand fire, cracking a little like sunburst in the middle. Quietly, we scream into the earth. Quietly, we give back. We're learning what it means to say yes, to sink beneath the soil until a girl walks by, scattering seeds, placing the watering can gently on our heads. The idea of moisture so close we can taste the metal, so thin it begins to melt, then dissolve.
Great. I would like you to read another one that makes you think of Montana.
Okay. That's it.
I'm getting very specific here.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Mostly because I've never been to Montana.
I think this poem, Evening News, is a good representation of what I was just talking about, of the weird, bizarre crimes. And it's also rooted in some Montana lore and landscape.
Great, thank you.
Evening News. A man shoots through another man, his chest a black sky of star holes. On the trail, a white male plucks a girl's clothes off like apples, articles and socks found in the creek nearby. The Amber Alert crawling through our backyards. We hold the bedspread to our necks and pray for less evidence, for safe and endless water. Fires plume the bitterroot on moss orange, 12 hells combing the hillside. A gas station clerk found with his neck boiled red in the register. All for a night of light heads. The football team record resting on the arm of a boy who is addicted to the way he feels after midnight, recently acquitted. Some move to be alone, to be common and replaceable by mountainsides. I hold on to myself like a grenade.
Thank you.
See, that's one of my favorite poems in the book.
Oh, yeah?
I studied that one really hard because that's a weird poem. There's some really strange images I had to puzzle through. I remember we exchanged some emails about that. The guy with his head in the register with the redneck or something like that. It's beautiful and haunted. And, there are these very realistic images out of landscape in his poems. And then these weird, surreal translations of the literal into something else entirely. And he pops back and forth between those things really quickly sometimes, like in that poem. That's one of my favorites.
Do you have one that you'd like Philip to read?
Well, yeah, any of them. He read the one I really wanted him to read, Growing Down. I heard more Whitman in it just when he read it out loud than even before, at the end of Song of Myself, when Whitman is dissolved into the I think he even used the word dissolve. I effuse myself in eddies. He's in the grass, and in this poem, Philip's being watered. That collective voice has dispersed itself and is ready to grow again, kind of like Whitman. There's a little bitty one. This isn't it's a little bitty one called Once that I love a lot, and it does another thing that he's so good at, and that's this really exacting, crystalline command of image. That's one of those. So maybe that little bitty one, if you wouldn't mind.
And just for my own personal thing, Once is my favorite poem.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's a heck of a good poem.
Because I care so much about the tight image and seeing how it can unfold a little bit.
Right.
I have to find it.
Page 16.
Oh, thank you.
Not that I remember.
Once, I took a mason jar of fireflies and shook them like a snow globe. So much death lighting up, Manhattan in my hands.
I read that poem just this morning.
That's a cool little poem.
Yeah.
It's got those three components to it, like a good haiku, or those three components like a good sonnet or like a good ode. That's an important kind of logical progression that it makes, although it's not logical at all. How we get from fireflies to all of Manhattan is just bizarre change in perspective. That's what's cool about it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's sort of magic.
Yeah. So we've had some pretty awful, this is kind of addressed to both of you, we've had some awful current events happening. I'm specifically thinking of Las Vegas. And so both of you are poets, and so how do you guys see poetry in the contemporary world? What role should poetry play in the contemporary world?
It has no role.
Good answer.
Its role is to be poetry. Its role is to make songful, beautiful, strange, challenging music, whether that's addressed to current events or not. I'm an editor of a big magazine, and I know in about a week I'm going to get about a zillion poems that rhyme gun with everything you could rhyme gun with. People respond to news so quickly and in such an untransfigured way in poetry world these days. I worry about that. So I want poems to be able to make their identity or make their case about anything, trauma, the news, a disaster, a waterfall, whatever. It takes a little while to process those things through the more complicated lenses that poetry typically looks through. There are things that poetry does that no other form of language does that we need as part of the mechanism for staying alive. That is a capability of empathy and otherness and silence and quiet, being able to live with complexity and rigor and not shoot it, not see the thing that isn't us and kill it or condemn it or disregard it or simply think we can buy it and possess it. Poetry resists all of those things pretty fully, but it takes a while to understand that. There's a really great passage, just a sentence or two, by William Carlos Williams in a poem of his called Asphodel, That Greeny Flower. Poets know this phrase, but you can't say it too many times in occasions like this. Williams says, it is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die every day for lack of what is found there. So the question is to think about what is found there and how to nurture that as a kind of alternative or resistance to the mere news or the mere catastrophic. Maybe. I don't know.
No, that was a great answer.
Yeah, great answer. I see poetry's role, and this is both true in my mind for occasions and responses to current events and just in general, as the poem not being a way to write about something, but a way to write into something. And I stress that whenever I teach or lead a workshop. every time I see something, they're trying to write about what just happened, and it fails. And usually because it's immediate. Now, sometimes the immediacy of a poem and what's inside you can come out and be successful, but sometimes it takes months to really process what happened and to have the skill and mind to put it down. I recently read someone, maybe even on Facebook, I can't remember, said, I don't believe in art as therapy or poetry as therapy. And I thought that was great.
I'm with that.
It might have even been Paisley, I can't remember. But it was something where I was like, yeah, this, don't try and put a bandage on this. Don't try and speak to a sounding board here. This is something that grows from the ground up. And I think the way to approach the poem and art in general out of these situations is to do what you know, but to let it be wild. That's not too vague.
Let it be wild. That's pretty good. Yeah. Do you have any questions for each other?
What are the parameters? Who's going to win the World Series? Yeah, I've got one. Post-book now. The book is just now out and is maybe starting to be received by readers, we hope. So what would he imagine his work, poem by poem, thinking about now? Is he working on poems? Is there another manuscript? Sort of like kind of what next?
Yes. In fact, I think just about a month ago, I started sending out my second full-length manuscript.
Oh, wow.
I've sent it to maybe 5 or 6 places. Like with this, I anticipate it going through a stretch of rejections or maybe a few close calls, who knows. And then I'll see a little bit of what needs to be tweaked. I'm pretty sure it's only 90% there. But I'm happy to have something that I think is close. That book, I'm still constantly writing. That book feels sort of like a sequel to this book. A lot of similar themes, but if you can imagine, it's darker. It plays more into my childhood and the role of religion. And my father's a pastor, a great pastor, a great human being. I am not cynical towards that, but I took a lot of my friends and other stories, situations, and made them the speakers. And so it deals a lot more with like childhood and youth and dark events that happen in and around that, which is terrifying to think about, but it happens. And it's called Salvation Party. And I grew up in a very, not quite Pentecostal, but sort of that charismatic of a world in the Christian Midwest. And thinking back on it now, it seems ludicrous to me. Just the stuff that was very normal every day, and now I'm so divorced from it that I can't believe it happened. And I know those are topics that are hard to write about. Everyone writes about God or religion or, anything. So it may just not be successful at all, but I went for it.
What was easier to put together, the first one or the second one?
Probably the second one.
Oh, interesting.
Because
That's assuming that it's done.
That's very true.
This doesn't happen fast.
No, and I don't think it's done. And I think I'll learn that the hard, long way, which is, at least I know that. But I sort of modeled it off the first one. So I had a frame of reference. It has 3 sections. It's not in the same content, but just structurally a lot easier for me. I've had good readers and friends of mine go through it and say, change this, change that, and they were epic changes for me. And maybe just going through the process of having a first one that found a home gave me confidence to know that I could do this again, even if it takes 20 years.
Great. So to wrap up, would you like to read one more poem for us?
Sure. Anything in mind?
No. You pick your second favorite since you read your favorite.
Deal. I'll read The New World, which is the first poem of the first section, but not the first poem of the book. The New World. Let's go back to when we were still undiscovered, to when losing meant losing and we lost everything. Our names, the candle of our bodies, small tokens of light clipping in and out of us like bullet holes. Our skin, a thing for fire. Let's rub the moon between thumb and forefinger until we disappear. There are galaxies of hurt, and in each of them we become masters. We crawl up the throat of the sky like dying animals and beg heaven to let us in. We don't believe in anything worth saving. The fields flashing in the quiet distance, the stars raked from the chest of the night like glowing leaves. In a way, we are as still as the day we were born. A pair of yellow eyes floating in a tree. The idea of flight so close, we stretch back an arrow until we are the arrow.
Great. I'd like to thank David Baker and Philip Schaefer for sitting down with us. And this has been Hannah New with the University of Utah Press.
Thanks, Hannah.